A poor widow gave birth to twin boys and was left to die in the desert. But the mountain man arrived. The sun burns red over the empty sands. A woman lies half buried in dust, clutching 2 crying infants. Her husband rode off hours ago, maybe days, leaving her to the buzzards. Then, through the heat shimmer, comes a stranger on horseback, a man who swore he'd never save another soul again. He came hunting for meat, yet found a miracle instead. But mercy has a price, because the law wants the man she loved, and someone's already riding hard to silence the truth. In the storm that follows, bullets will fly, a secret will surface, and faith will be tested on the edge of a canyon. Will a man who's lost everything find the courage to protect the innocent? Or will the desert claim them all before sunrise? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Boone McCrae guided his mule along the dusty trail west of Fort Lowell. Sweat trickled down his weathered face, dampening the collar of his faded cotton shirt. His keen eyes scanned the scrubland for signs of mule deer, knowing winter would come harsh and swift to these parts. Best to stock up on jerky while the hunting was good. The leather of his saddle creaked as he shifted his weight, adjusting the Winchester rifle across his lap. Years of living alone in the mountains had taught him to move quiet-like, to become part of the landscape itself. His own breathing seemed loud in the stillness of the desert afternoon. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple, Boone's trained ear caught something unusual, a sound that didn't belong in this empty stretch of territory. A cry, high and thin, carried on the evening breeze. Not a coyote's yip or a bird's call, but something that made his heart clench with recognition. A baby's wail. Boone pulled his mule to a halt, listening intently. There it came again, stronger this time, accompanied by another similar cry. His jaw tightened as he turned his mount toward the sound, following it to a slight depression in the land where a lone cottonwood stretched its dying branches toward the darkening sky. The sight that greeted him made his throat go dry. A freight wagon lay on its side, one wheel spinning lazily in the hot breeze, supplies scattered across the ground like fallen leaves. Beneath the cottonwood's sparse shade lay a woman, her dress stained with dust and darker things he didn't want to name. In her arms, she clutched 2 tiny bundles wrapped in what looked like old feed sacks. Boone dismounted quickly, his boots raising small clouds of dust as he approached. The woman's eyes were closed, her face pale as winter frost, but her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Beads of sweat dotted her forehead, despite the cooling evening air. Fever, he recognized with a grim certainty. "Ma'am?" he called softly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of summer storms. "Water," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Please, water for my babies." Boone didn't hesitate. He retrieved his canteen, uncorking it with practiced ease. Gently, he supported the woman's head as she took small sips. Then, with more care than most would expect from his calloused hands, he helped her give drops of precious water to the 2 infants. As he worked, his experienced eyes took in the scene around them. A man's boots had left clear tracks in the dust, leading away from the wagon and off into the desert. The sight made his jaw clench. What kind of man abandons his wife and newborn babies? "Name's Boone McCrae," he said quietly, settling back on his haunches. "Can you tell me yours, ma'am?" "Sophia," she managed between labored breaths. "Sophia Tisdale." Her eyes darted to the horizon, then back to his face. "My husband, He just walked away. Said he couldn't handle twins. The responsibility. A tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. The words struck something deep in Boone's chest, a place he'd kept locked away for years. His own memories surged forward. Sarah's face, pale and still, their infant son already gone ahead of her. He pushed the thoughts away with practiced determination. This woman needed help now, not his old ghosts. Working quickly, Boone tore strips from his own shirt, creating makeshift bandages for some of Sophia's visible wounds. The twins, miracle of miracles, seemed healthy enough despite their crude swaddling. As darkness crept across the land, he gathered dry brush and built a small fire, positioning it to block the worst of the wind. "The coyotes," Sophia whispered as night fell, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, don't let them take my babies." "Ain't nothing getting near these little ones," Boone assured her, checking his rifle was within easy reach. "You rest now. I'll keep watch." Through the long night hours, Boone sat sentinel by the fire. The coyotes did come, their eyes glowing like amber coins in the darkness, but they kept their distance. His presence and the fire were enough to warn them off. Every so often he'd check on Sophia and the twins, making sure they were warm enough, offering water when she stirred. As he watched over them, memories he'd long suppressed rose up like spring floods. Sarah's gentle laugh, the way she'd sung hymns while working in their small cabin, the hope in her eyes when she'd told him about the baby. Then the winter that took them both, leaving him alone with nothing but his grief and guilt. He'd turned away from everything after that, community, faith, hope itself. What good were prayers when they went unanswered? But now, watching Sophia cradle her infants even in her fevered sleep, something shifted in his chest. These three needed help, and he was the only one around to give it. The thought of riding away and leaving them to fate made his stomach turn. As the first gray light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Boone had made his decision. He couldn't save Sarah and their son, but maybe, just maybe, he could help save these three. He began carefully loading Sophia and the twins onto his mule, using blankets from his bedroll to create a secure nest for them. Where are we going?" Sophia asked weakly as he helped settle her. "Got a cabin up in the hills," he replied, adjusting the blankets around her and the babies. "It ain't much, but it's sturdy and dry. We'll get you feeling better up there." Sophia's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "The Lord must have sent you." Boone didn't respond to that, but something in his chest tightened at her words. He hadn't thought about the Lord's providence in years, had actively avoided such thoughts. But looking at the way the rising sun painted Sophia's face with hope, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more at work here than simple chance. Leading the mule carefully, Boone turned toward the hills that had been his solitary home for so long. The morning light stretched their shadows long across the desert floor. One man, one mule, and 3 souls he'd somehow become responsible for. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders, heavy but not unwelcome. Each step took them further from the abandoned wagon and the tracks that led nowhere, toward something Boone couldn't quite name. The twins had fallen quiet, soothed by their mother's presence and the gentle swaying of the mule's gait. Sophia dozed fitfully, her fever still burning but her grip on her babies never loosening. As they traveled, Boone found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, praying. Not the formal prayers of his youth, but simple, urgent thoughts sent skyward. Please let them survive the journey. Please let me remember enough of Sarah's healing ways to help. Please let my strength be enough for all of us. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they made their way toward the hills, leaving behind the scene of abandonment and despair. With each step, Boone felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack, letting in something that felt dangerously like hope. He wasn't sure he was ready for that, but looking at the precious cargo his mule carried, he reckoned he didn't have much choice in the matter. The decision to help them had been simple in the end, as clear as the tracks in the dust, as powerful as a baby's cry in the wilderness. What that decision would mean for his carefully constructed solitude, for the peace he'd found in isolation, remained to be seen. But watching Sophia hold her children close even in her fevered state, Boone knew he couldn't have chosen differently. The morning wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain as they made their slow way home. Home. The word felt different now, as if it had expanded to include more than just himself. The thought should have frightened him, but instead, it filled him with a curious warmth he hadn't felt in years. His mule's ears flicked back and forth, alert for danger, but the morning remained quiet except for the soft sounds of their passage. Boone kept one hand near his rifle, ever watchful, while his other held the mule's lead rope with gentle firmness. The twins slept on, unaware of the change their presence had wrought in the heart of the mountain man, who now guided their path toward safety. The morning sun climbed higher as Boone guided his mule along the winding trail into the hills. Every few minutes, he glanced back at his precious cargo, Sophia and her twins, bundled securely on the mule's broad back. The woman's face remained flushed with fever, though she held her babies close even in her restless sleep. Around mid-morning, Boone spotted the familiar outline of an old prospector's dugout nestled against the hillside. He'd found it months ago while tracking deer and had made note of its location, though he'd never thought he'd have cause to use it. Now, he thanked Providence for its shelter. The dugout's entrance faced east, protecting it from the worst of the wind, and its thick earthen walls would help keep out the coming storm he could smell on the air. "Whoa there," he murmured to his mule, bringing them to a gentle stop. The structure wasn't much, just a simple room dug into the hillside with log supports and a rough timbered roof, but it would serve better than the open trail. With careful movements, Boone helped ease Sophia and her infants down from the mule. She stirred slightly but didn't fully wake, her skin burning against his hands. The twins began to fuss, their tiny faces scrunching up with hunger and discomfort. Inside the dugout, Boone found a patch of old straw in one corner, probably left by the prospector for bedding. He spread his cleanest blanket over it before laying Sophia down. The twins he placed beside her, tucked safely between their mother and the earthen wall. "First things first," he muttered to himself, unpacking his saddlebags. The creek burbled nearby, a blessing he hadn't counted on. With his tin cup in hand, he made his way down to the water. The sound of the twins' increasing cries followed him, spurring his steps. At the creek, Boone filled his canteen and cup, then searched the banks until he found what he needed, the rough bark of mesquite trees. Sarah had taught him about its healing properties, back when she was alive. The memory came with its usual ache, but he pushed it aside. There was work to be done. Back in the dugout, he set water to boil over a small fire, adding strips of the mesquite bark. The twins' cries had grown more insistent, their little faces red with effort. Sophia stirred restlessly but didn't wake. "Now then," Boone said softly, reaching into his saddlebag again. He pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle that contained dried goat's milk, another of his supplies for long hunting trips. It wasn't perfect for babies, but it would have to do. He mixed the milk with warm water in his tin cup, testing it against his wrist the way he remembered Sarah doing with their son. The first twin, the slightly larger one, took to it quickly when Boone held the cup carefully to his lips. The second baby proved more stubborn, but hunger eventually won out. As he fed them, Boone found himself speaking softly, the words coming unbidden. "There now, little ones. That's the way. Ain't nothing to fret about." The sound of his own gentle tone surprised him. He'd grown unused to speaking much at all in his years of solitude. When the mesquite bark tea had cooled enough, he lifted Sophia's head and helped her drink small sips. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, fever-bright but more focused than before. "My babies?" she whispered. "They're right here," Boone assured her. "Just fed them both. They're sleeping quiet now." Relief flooded her face, followed by a shadow of deeper pain. "Elias," she said, her voice breaking. He left us when the pain started." Her hands clutched weakly at the blanket. "Took our mule, our rifle, said he couldn't handle twins, the responsibility." A tear slid down her temple into her hair. Boone felt anger surge through him, hot and fierce. The kind of man who'd leave his wife alone to birth babies in the wilderness and take their means of survival wasn't worth the name of man at all. But he kept his voice steady, knowing Sophia needed calm more than righteousness. "You rest now," he said simply. "You're safe here." Throughout the afternoon, Boone tended to his charges. He gave Sophia more of the mesquite bark tea, kept the twins clean and fed, and gathered firewood for the coming night. The air had grown heavy with the promise of storm, and the thunder that had been mumbling in the distance drew steadily closer. As evening approached, he noticed gaps in the dugout's roof where rain might seep through. The prospector's abandonment had left the structure somewhat worse for wear. Boone dragged fallen branches from nearby, weaving them carefully into the existing roof supports. It wasn't pretty work, but it would help keep them dry. Night fell early, hastened by the gathering storm clouds. Boone built up the fire, positioning it near the entrance where its smoke could escape, but its warmth would fill the small space. The twins had been fussy again, wanting another feeding, and he'd just gotten them settled when the first real crash of thunder shook the hills. Sophia startled awake, her eyes wide with fear. "The babies are right beside you," Boone assured her, moving to check on them. "See? Sleeping sound as you please. Thunder don't bother them none." She relaxed slightly, though her face still showed signs of fever. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. I don't know what we would have done if—" Her voice caught. Boone nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. He busied himself adding another piece of wood to the fire, watching the sparks rise up toward the reinforced roof. The wind outside had picked up, carrying the first fat drops of rain. Without conscious thought, Boone found his lips moving in prayer. "Lord," he whispered, so quiet he could barely hear himself, "keep them safe through this night." The words felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't prayed since Sarah died, hadn't seen the point. But something about these 3 lost souls in his care had shifted something in him, like spring thaw breaking river ice. The storm raged through the night, but the dugout held strong. Boone dozed sitting up, waking at every small sound, the twins stirring, Sophia's restless movements, the thunder's crash. He fed the babies twice more, awkwardly at first but with growing confidence. His big hands, more used to skinning game and setting traps, learned to cradle their tiny bodies with surprising gentleness. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Boone noticed a change in Sophia. Her breathing had grown easier, and when he touched her forehead, the burning heat had lessened. Color had begun to return to her cheeks, not the hectic flush of fever, but a healthier pink. She woke fully as he was feeding one of the twins, holding the other carefully in the crook of his arm. The sight made her pause, something soft crossing her face as she watched him whisper to them. "There now, little fellow," he was saying to the nursing baby. "Your brother here already had his share. Your turn now." He glanced up to find Sophia watching him, and something in her gaze made him flush slightly. "Hope you don't mind," he said gruffly. "They were hungry, and you needed the rest." "I don't mind," she said softly. "You're good with them. Like you've done this before." Boone was quiet for a long moment, looking down at the tiny face of the baby in his arms. "Had a son," he said finally, his voice rough. "Long time ago. He and his mama, winter took them both." Understanding filled Sophia's eyes, along with deep compassion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Boone nodded, not trusting himself to speak again. The baby in his arms had fallen asleep, tiny fingers curled against his shirt. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed earth and new possibilities. The sun rose fully, sending fingers of light through the dugout's entrance. Sophia managed to sit up slightly, reaching for her babies. Boone helped settle them against her, noting with satisfaction that her hands were steadier, her movements more certain. The fever had broken during the night. As he built up the morning fire and set water to boil for more tea, Boone found himself studying the small family. The twins were barely 2 days old, yet they'd already survived more than many grown men could handle. Their mother's strength amazed him. Not just physical, endurance, but the depth of her faith and care for her children. Even after being abandoned by the one who should have protected them all, she hadn't given up. The sight of them stirred something in his chest that he'd thought long dead, a fierce protectiveness, a need to ensure their safety and well-being. He'd been content in his solitude, or so he'd told himself, but watching Sophia with her babies made him realize how empty his life had become. Thunder still rumbled in the distance, but it was moving away now, taking the storm with it. Boone knew they couldn't stay in the dugout forever. His cabin would be better for them all. But for now, this shelter would serve. They had food, water, warmth, and safety. The rest would come in its own time. The days blurred together as Boone tended to Sophia and the twins. Her fever ebbed and flowed like tide waters, leaving her lucid one moment and lost in delirium the next. The babies needed constant care, feeding, changing, comfort. Boone found himself settling into the rhythm of it, his hands growing more sure with each passing hour. By the third morning, his supplies were running low. The goat's milk wouldn't last another day, and his stock of healing herbs had dwindled to almost nothing. Worse, Sophia's fever stubbornly refused to break. She needed real medicine, the kind that came in glass bottles from army posts, not just wild-gathered remedies. Boone checked the fire one last time, making sure it would burn steady for hours. He'd positioned water and milk within Sophia's reach, though she was too weak to do much more than sip when he helped her. The twins were sleeping peacefully in their makeshift bed of soft rabbit furs. "I need to make a supply run," he told her during one of her clear moments. "Won't be gone more than half a day. You think you can manage?" Sophia nodded weakly, her face flushed with fever. "We'll be fine," she whispered. "The Lord watches over us." Something in her simple faith made his throat tight. He ducked his head, checking the twins swaddling one more time. "I'll be back before sundown," he promised. The morning air was crisp as Boone rode out, his mule's hooves kicking up dust from the rain-dried trail. He had a decent load of pelts in his saddlebags, beaver, rabbit, and one prime mountain lion skin he'd been saving for winter trading. They should fetch enough to buy what was needed. Fort Lowell rose from the desert like a child's wooden blocks, sun-bleached and square against the endless sky. Boone had avoided the place for years, preferring solitude to soldiers' questions, but necessity drove him now. He tied his mule at the trading post and carried his pelts inside. The trader, a gruff man named Morton, brightened at the sight of the mountain lion pelt. "Fine piece of work there, McCrae. Been a while since we've seen you." Boone nodded, laying out his goods. "Need medicine. Quinine if you've got it. Flour too, and whatever milk you can spare." Morton's eyebrows rose at the unusual request. Boone had never bought anything but ammunition and basic supplies before. But the trader asked no questions, just started calculating values. While Morton worked, Boone's attention was drawn to voices from the fort's yard. A group of soldiers had gathered near the gates, their conversation drifting through the open door. "Tisdale's wagon, has to be. Found it west of here, blood everywhere." "Any sign of the family?" "Nothing yet. Probably didn't make it." Boone's hands tightened on the counter. He forced himself to stay still, to keep his face neutral as he listened. "Bastard killed 2 men in Yuma," one soldier spat. "Robbed the paymaster's office. Now his own wife and child." "Children," another corrected. "Word is she was carrying twins." Morton returned with Boone's supplies, wrapped carefully in brown paper. "That's $13 even, with the pelts." Boone paid without haggling, his mind racing. He secured the packages to his saddle with deliberate care, not rushing despite his urge to flee. No sense drawing attention. The soldiers continued their discussion, unaware of his interest. "Search party's out, but with this heat. Poor woman, poor babies." The ride back seemed endless, though Boone pushed his mule harder than usual. The sun was still well above the horizon when he reached the dugout. Inside, Sophia lay where he'd left her, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been in days. "You're back early," she said softly, managing a weak smile. Boone nodded, unpacking his supplies. He measured out the quinine carefully, mixing it with water. "Medicine for your fever," he explained, helping her drink. "Tastes bitter, but it'll help." She grimaced at the flavor, but swallowed obediently. One of the twins began to fuss, and Boone lifted him before the cry could wake his brother. The baby settled quickly in his arms, familiar now with his touch. "The soldiers," Sophia said suddenly. "At the fort. Did anyone mention Elias?" Boone's heart clenched. He busied himself with the baby, avoiding her eyes. "No word," he said quietly. "Nothing about him." The lie felt like ashes in his mouth, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. Not now, when she was still so weak. Not ever, maybe. The knowledge that her husband was a murderer, that he'd killed even before abandoning her, it would break something in her he wasn't sure could be mended. "Oh." Her voice was small, tired. "I thought, perhaps." "Try to rest," Boone said gently. "Medicine needs time to work." After she drifted off, Boone slipped outside. The sun was setting, painting the hills in shades of gold and shadow. He remembered the blood-stained jacket he'd found beneath the overturned wagon, hidden quickly before Sophia could see it. He'd stuffed it under a rock, meaning to deal with it later. Now he retrieved it, noting the dark stains that spoke of violence. Had the blood belonged to Elias's victims in Yuma? Or had he been wounded himself? It didn't matter. The jacket was evidence of crimes Sophia didn't need to know about. Boone built a small fire away from the dugout. As the flames caught, he whispered a prayer, his second in 3 days, after years of silence. "Lord," he murmured, "forgive me this lie. Let it shelter her, like these hills shelter us all." He fed the jacket to the fire piece by piece, watching until nothing remained but ash. The truth would stay buried with it, a mercy bought with deception. The choice sat heavy in his chest, but when he thought of Sophia's face, her trust and faith still intact despite everything. He knew he'd make the same decision again. Back inside the dugout, Sophia slept peacefully, her fever finally beginning to ease. The twins lay curled together like puppies, their tiny hands touching. Boone added wood to the fire and settled in for his watch, prayer still echoing in his mind. The quinine did its work through the night. By morning, Sophia's skin was cooler, her breathing easier. She managed to sit up and hold her babies, though the effort left her trembling with weakness. Boone kept his secrets behind careful silence, tending to their needs with gentle efficiency. Outside, the desert wind carried away the last traces of ash from Elias's jacket. Inside, Boone watched Sophia nurse her twins, her face tender with love despite all she'd endured. He'd chosen mercy over truth, protection over justice. The path ahead was unclear, but for now, in this moment, he knew he'd done right by these 3 souls in his care. The sun climbed higher, bringing another day of healing and hidden truths. Sophia hummed softly to her babies, a hymn that filled the dugout with quiet peace. Boone added flour to boiling water for porridge, his movements sure and steady. They were safe here, all of them, sheltered by stone and straw and necessary lies. The days melted together like spring snow in the high country. Sophia's strength returned gradually, her color improving with each sunrise. The dugout, once just a shelter of necessity, began to feel almost like a home. Boone watched the transformation with quiet wonder, noting how she'd arranged their meager supplies with care, how she'd hung fresh herbs to dry from the rough-hewn rafters. The twins, Jacob and Luke, grew stronger too. Their tiny fists would wave in the air as they cooed, their eyes tracking movement with growing awareness. Boone found himself pausing in his work just to watch them, marveling at how their personalities were already emerging. Jacob was the louder of the two, demanding attention with lusty cries, while Luke observed the world with solemn curiosity. "They're starting to look more like themselves," Sophia remarked one morning, cradling Luke while Jacob nursed. "Less like little red strangers?" Boone nodded, allowing himself a small smile. He'd begun to recognize their different cries, knowing which meant hunger and which meant comfort was needed. The knowledge settled in his chest, like a warm coal, familiar and dangerous. The creek that ran past the dugout provided clear, sweet water and a place for Sophia to wash their few clothes. She'd insisted on doing this herself as soon as she could walk steadily, though Boone kept watch from a discreet distance, bow in hand. The sound of her soft humming mixed with the splash of water and the rustle of wind through cottonwoods. "You don't have to hover quite so close," she called out one afternoon, wringing water from a shirt. "I promise not to float away." "Just hunting rabbits," he replied, though they both knew it was more than that. The wilderness held too many threats to leave her unguarded. His vigilance proved wise when, near sundown that same day, he spotted movement on the western ridge. 2 riders, their military-issue saddles visible even at distance, were making their way along the game trail. Boone's pulse quickened. He'd been expecting this, knowing the army wouldn't give up their search easily. He motioned for Sophia to take the babies inside, then settled himself casually by the creek, cleaning a rabbit he'd shot earlier. The scouts approached with the easy confidence of men who expected cooperation. "Evening," the first rider called out, reining his horse to a stop. "Hope we're not disturbing your supper?" Boone shrugged, keeping his movements unhurried. "Plenty to spare, if you're hungry." "Much obliged, but we're on official business." The second rider, younger and eager, leaned forward in his saddle. "Looking for a fugitive named Tisdale, Elias Tisdale. Army's offering $500 reward for information leading to his capture." That's a fair sum, Boone said carefully, his voice betraying nothing of the ice in his veins. He's wanted for murder and robbery down Yuma way, the first rider explained. Killed 2 men in cold blood. We found his wagon a few days back, but no sign of him or his family. Boone wiped his knife clean on a patch of grass, buying time to steady his voice. Haven't seen any strangers lately. Most folks avoid these hills. Any tracks? Signs of passage? The younger scout was clearly disappointed by Boone's lack of information. Saw some wagon marks heading south toward the old Mission Road, Boone offered. Few days old now. Might have been your man. The scouts exchanged glances. South, you say? The first rider nodded thoughtfully. That fits with other reports. He'd be trying for the border. They asked a few more questions, but Boone's apparent disinterest and isolation made him an unlikely source of useful information. Soon enough, they tipped their hats and turned their horses south, following the false trail he'd given them. Boone waited until they were well out of sight before hurrying to the dugout. Inside, Sophia sat rigid with fear, one baby clutched to each shoulder. They're gone, he assured her, but his voice was grim. We can't stay here. But why? She whispered, though her pale face showed she already knew. We're safe here, hidden. Those weren't the only scouts they'll send. Boone began gathering their supplies, his movements quick but methodical. Next pair might know these hills better, might ask more questions. We need to be gone before dawn. Sophia's hands trembled as she laid the sleeping twins in their makeshift cradle. Where will we go? Higher up, into the mountains proper. Boone paused in his packing, meeting her eyes directly. It won't be easy, but I know places where no one will think to look. She nodded slowly, trust and fear warring in her expression. How long do we have? A few hours, enough time to pack what we need, no more. They worked through the night, gathering the precious supplies that meant survival in the wilderness. Boone had a small wagon he'd traded for years ago, sturdy enough for rough country, if not heavily loaded. They packed carefully, dried meat and beans, cooking gear, blankets, the few clothes they owned. Every item had to justify its weight. The twins slept through most of the preparation, waking only to nurse before settling again. Sophia moved with quiet efficiency despite her obvious exhaustion, asking few questions as she followed Boone's instructions about what to take and what to leave behind. The soldiers, she said finally, as they loaded the last of their goods. They mentioned a reward. Boone secured a rope around their supplies before answering. $500. That's more money than most men see in years. Her voice was barely audible. You could have told them about us, about me. He turned to face her, his expression softening in the pre-dawn light. No, I couldn't. The simple truth in his words brought tears to her eyes. She ducked her head, busying herself with checking the twins' swaddling one more time. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when they finished their preparations. Boone helped Sophia into the wagon bed, where she could lie comfortably with the babies beside her. He'd arranged straw and blankets to cushion the journey, knowing every jolt would be felt. Ready? He asked softly. She nodded, drawing the twins close. Jacob made a small sound in his sleep, while Luke's tiny hand clutched at his brother's blanket. The sight made Boone's chest ache with memories of another woman, another child, lost to the wilderness years ago. He pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the path ahead. The wagon creaked as they started moving, wood and metal protesting the early hour. Boone led them away from the dugout, following game trails he'd hunted for years. The dawn wind carried dust across the horizon, nature itself conspiring to hide their tracks. They traveled in silence as the sun rose, each lost in their own thoughts. Boone kept them to the shadows where possible, avoiding the more obvious trails. Every so often he'd stop to listen, making sure no other travelers were near. The twins stayed remarkably quiet, as if they understood the need for secrecy. Looking back, Sophia could just make out the cottonwood tree that marked their abandoned shelter. The sight of it disappearing into the distance brought fresh tears, but she brushed them away quickly. They were leaving safety for uncertainty, trading their small measure of peace for the unknown. But as she watched Boone's broad shoulders while he led them higher into the mountains, Sophia felt something else beneath her fear. Trust. This quiet man who'd found her dying beneath a tree, who'd nursed her babies and lied to soldiers to protect them. He'd become her anchor in a world turned upside down. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Behind them, the lower country stretched out like a patchwork quilt, greens and browns fading into the distance. Ahead, the mountains rose in rugged promise, offering hiding places in their steep valleys and shadowed forests. Boone kept them moving steadily upward, choosing their path with the care of someone who knew every fold in the land. They were leaving civilization behind with every step, but Sophia found she didn't mind. Civilization, after all, hadn't done much to protect her or her children. The twins woke properly as the morning warmed, demanding attention. Sophia nursed them while Boone continued leading the wagon, his back carefully turned to give her privacy. Such consideration had become natural between them, an unspoken agreement born of necessity and respect. "They're taking to the journey well," she commented after the babies were fed and settled again. Boone glanced back, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Strong boys? Like their mama?" The simple praise warmed her more than the rising sun. They continued their careful ascent, leaving the world they'd known behind, sealing their partnership in shared secrets and silent understanding. Whatever lay ahead in the high country, they would face it together. The mountain trail twisted upward like a wounded snake, narrow and treacherous in places. Boone walked beside the wagon, one hand resting on its wooden side, ready to brace it if the wheels slipped. The old mule picked its way carefully, hooves finding purchase on the rocky path with the wisdom of years in rough country. Sophia sat in the wagon bed, her back against their bundled supplies. The twins nursed beneath her worn shawl while she hummed an old hymn, her soft voice barely carrying over the creak of wagon wheels. The familiar melody of Amazing Grace drifted down the mountainside, offering comfort in its ancient verses. "Careful here," Boone warned, gesturing to a particularly steep section. "Hold them close." She drew the babies tighter against her chest as the wagon tilted slightly. Jacob made a small sound of protest at being jostled, but Luke continued nursing peacefully. The contrast between her sons' temperaments never failed to make her smile, even in these uncertain times. The sun tracked westward as they climbed, shadows lengthening across the trail. The air grew cooler with each 100 feet of elevation gained, and the vegetation began to change. Scrub oak gave way to the first scattered pines, their green needles sighing in the mountain wind. "We're getting close to pine country proper," Boone explained, pausing to let the mule catch its breath. "Better shelter up there. Fewer folks passing through?" Sophia nodded, adjusting her shawl as the twins finished nursing. "The air smells different here, sweeter somehow." "That's the pine resin." Boone's voice carried a hint of approval. "Useful stuff. I'll show you later." They continued upward until the sun hung low on the horizon, painting the western sky in shades of amber and rose. Boone led them off the main trail, following what looked like a game path until it opened into a small clearing beside a mountain stream. The water tumbled over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow, its sound a soothing whisper in the gathering dusk. "We'll camp here tonight," he announced, helping Sophia down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff from the day's journey, and she stumbled slightly. His strong hands steadied her, lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary before he turned to unhitch the mule. While Boone tended to the animal, Sophia changed the twins and settled them in their makeshift bed, a sturdy wooden box padded with blankets. Both babies were alert now, watching the pine boughs wave against the darkening sky with wide-eyed wonder. "Come here," Boone called softly. "Let me show you something important." He led her to a nearby pine tree, its trunk straight and tall. Dark streams of resin had dried along its bark where previous injuries had healed. "This pitch burns hot and long," he explained, using his knife to carefully scrape some into a tin. "Good for starting fires, even in wet weather. Could save your life someday." Sophia watched intently as he demonstrated how to gather the sticky substance without wasting it. Her fingers were clumsy at first, but she soon got the knack of it. "Like this?" "That's right." His approval warmed her more than it should have. "You're a quick study." They worked together to make camp, moving with the efficiency of those who had learned to rely on each other. Boone built a small fire, while Sophia prepared their simple meal, hardtack softened in water and beans he'd traded for at the fort. The food wasn't fancy, but it would keep them strong for the journey ahead. As they ate, the night settled around them like a heavy blanket. Stars emerged one by one, brilliant in the mountain air. The twins slept peacefully in their box, small hands occasionally twitching as they dreamed their infant dreams. "Had a wife once?" Boone said suddenly, his voice so quiet Sophia almost missed the words. He stared into the fire, seeing something far beyond the dancing flames. "And a baby girl, near Santa Fe." Sophia set down her tin plate, understanding the weight of what he was sharing. She didn't speak, giving him space to continue if he chose. "Sarah was her name. My wife. Our daughter was Grace." His hands tightened around his cup. "Fever took them both 6 years ago come winter. Nothing I could do but watch them slip away." Without thinking, Sophia reached out, her hand brushing his sleeve in silent comfort. He didn't pull away from the touch. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "No one should have to bear such loss alone." "Been alone ever since." His voice was rough with memory. "Figured it was safer that way, until—" He didn't finish the thought, but his glance toward her and the sleeping twins said what words couldn't. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the stream's endless song and the occasional pop of burning pine pitch in the fire. As the night deepened, coyotes began their chorus in the distance, their wild voices echoing off the mountain slopes. Sophia shivered slightly, not entirely from the cold. "They won't come near the fire," Boone assured her, rising to his feet. "But I'd best check our defenses." She watched as he moved around their small camp with purpose, covering the wagon wheels with branches to hide their tracks. His movements were those of a man used to being hunted, or at least wary of pursuit. The reminder of their precarious situation sent another shiver through her. "The scouts?" she asked softly when he returned to the fire. Boone nodded grimly. "They'll keep searching. $500 is a powerful motivation for some men." He added another piece of wood to the fire, sending sparks spinning upward like earthbound stars. "But they won't find us up here. I know these mountains better than any of them." "Why?" The question had been burning in her mind all day. "Why risk so much for us?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. Maybe because I couldn't save them, Sarah and Grace. Maybe because when I found you under that cottonwood, I saw a chance to do something right in this world. His eyes met hers across the fire. Or maybe because every soul deserves mercy, even if they don't believe it themselves. Sophia felt tears prick at her eyes, understanding he wasn't just talking about her and the twins. This lonely man who'd lost everything had found something worth protecting again, worth risking his life and freedom for. The realization humbled her. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning far more than just his words. He nodded once, accepting what she couldn't fully express. The fire crackled between them, its warmth creating a small circle of safety in the vast mountain night. One of the twins, Luke, by the sound of his soft cooing, stirred briefly before settling again. "Should get some rest," Boone suggested, rising to check the horses one last time. "Long trail ahead tomorrow." Sophia made her bed in the wagon, close to the twins' box. Boone settled nearby on his bedroll, close enough to protect, but maintaining proper distance. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the wagon canvas. As she drifted toward sleep, Sophia found herself thinking about the strange paths that had led them here. Her with her newborn twins, fleeing a husband's betrayal, and this quiet mountain man carrying his own deep wounds. They were broken people, perhaps, but together they had found something like hope. The coyotes sang their wild songs in the distance, but Sophia wasn't afraid anymore. She knew Boone was watching, knew his strength and care would keep them safe. As sleep finally claimed her, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the mercy that had brought him to her that day beneath the cottonwood. Trust, she realized as consciousness faded, was like a tender plant taking root in rocky soil. It grew slowly, carefully, but once established, it could weather any storm. What she and Boone shared now was the beginning of such growth, born of necessity perhaps, but nourished by something deeper. Together, they would find a way to survive whatever lay ahead. The mountain stream murmured its endless song, and the stars wheeled overhead, witnesses to the quiet moment when two wounded souls chose to face their uncertain future as one. The trail grew steeper with each passing day. By the third morning, their mule's breath came in heavy clouds against the thinning air. Boone led them along narrow switchbacks, choosing each step with care. The twins, bundled against the mountain chill, stayed remarkably quiet, as if sensing the need for caution. Near midday, they rounded a sharp bend, and Sophia caught her first glimpse of the line shack through the trees. The small structure hunched against the mountainside, its weathered logs telling stories of winters long past. One corner had partially collapsed, letting pale sunlight stripe the dirt floor through broken rafters. "It ain't much," Boone said, studying her reaction, "but it's shelter." Sophia climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the journey. "It's perfect," she replied, meaning it. After weeks of running, even this broken building felt like a gift. Boone tied the mule in a sheltered spot and began unloading their meager supplies. "Chimney looks sound," he observed, eyeing the stone stack that rose straight and true above the damaged roof. That's the important thing. While he examined the shack's structure, Sophia settled the twins in a protected corner, wrapping them snugly in her shawl. Jacob and Luke blinked up at her with matching dark eyes, their tiny fingers curling around her own. "We're home now, little ones," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince them or herself. The next hours passed in steady work. Boone moved with purpose, gathering strips of bark from nearby trees and thick clumps of moss from the shadowed places between rocks. He showed Sophia how the natural materials could be layered to keep out wind and rain, then set about patching the broken section of roof. Inside, Sophia faced her own battle with years of accumulated dirt. The hearth was thick with soot and old ashes, but the chimney drew well when she tested it with a small fire. She found a sturdy branch to use as a broom and began sweeping, working outward from the fireplace in widening circles. "Had hunters in here last season, looks like," Boone commented, examining marks on the walls as he worked. "But nothing bigger than human." The unspoken worry about bears or mountain lions eased slightly in Sophia's chest. By sunset, the roof was sealed against the weather, and the floor was swept clean. Sophia had scrubbed the hearthstones until they glowed dully in the fading light. A proper fire burned now, pushing back the mountain chill. The twins lay nearby on a bed of fresh pine boughs, watching the flames dance with wide-eyed fascination. "Snow's coming," Boone said that evening, studying the heavy clouds gathering above the peaks. "Earlier than usual this year." He began pulling their dried meat from the wagon, carrying it inside in careful armfuls. Sophia helped him hang the precious food from the rafters, safely out of reach of any curious creatures that might find their way inside. The rich smell of smoke-cured venison filled the small space, mingling with pine sap and wood smoke. It smelled, she realized with a start, like home. The next morning, Boone disappeared into the forest with his axe and saw. The steady rhythm of his work drifted back to the shack where Sophia tended the twins and continued making their shelter more livable. When he returned in the afternoon, he carried several rough-cut pine boards. "What are you making?" she asked, watching him sort through the lumber with careful attention. His hands stilled for a moment. "Figured the boys need a proper place to sleep," he said quietly. "Can't keep them in that box forever." Sophia's throat tightened with unexpected emotion as she watched him begin to work. His big hands moved with surprising delicacy as he shaped the pine boards, carefully fitting them together into the beginning of a cradle large enough for both twins. While he worked, Sophia sat near the fire, with her worn dress spread across her lap. The fabric was far beyond repair in some places, but other sections could be salvaged. Her needle flashed in the firelight as she cut and pieced together small garments for the growing babies. The days settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Boone rose before dawn to check his trap lines and hunt, returning with food and firewood. Sophia kept the home fires burning, tending the twins and turning their rough shelter into something more comfortable. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew easier, more companionable. The mountain itself seemed to embrace their presence. Wind sighed through the pines like prayer, and stars blazed with impossible brightness in the clear night sky. Even the twins seemed to sense the peace of the place, their cries becoming less frequent as they grew accustomed to their new home. Sunday dawned clear and cold. Sophia sat by the fire, the twins freshly fed and content in their new cradle. Boone's careful workmanship evident in every smooth joint and gentle curve. She pulled her small Bible from her pocket, its leather cover worn soft with use. "Would you—" She hesitated, then gathered her courage. "Would you read to us?" Boone looked up from where he was mending a trap. Something flickered across his face, uncertainty, perhaps, or an older pain. But he set his work aside and came to sit near her by the fire. She handed him the Bible, opened to the 23rd Psalm. His fingers trembled slightly as he took it, and she pretended not to notice the way he blinked rapidly before beginning to read. "The Lord is my shepherd." His deep voice filled the small space, rough with emotion. "I shall not want." The familiar words took on new meaning in this place, so far from civilization, yet somehow closer to their source. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Sophia watched Boone's face as he read, seeing something wake there that had long been sleeping. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. The twins stirred in their cradle, settling again as their father's voice continued. Father in all but blood, Sophia thought, watching him read with such care. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. His voice caught slightly on the words about death, and Sophia knew he was thinking of his lost family. But he pressed on, drawing strength from the ancient promises. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Outside, snow began to fall, the first flakes of winter drifting past the window like bits of light. But inside was warmth and hope and the sound of faith reawakening. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The last words hung in the air like a benediction. Boone closed the Bible carefully, his hands steadier now as he returned it to her. Neither spoke for a long moment, letting the peace of the morning wash over them. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. Thank you, she said simply. Boone nodded, his eyes distant. Been a long time, he admitted, since I let myself believe in any of it. Faith finds us sometimes, Sophia said softly, even when we think we've lost it forever. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them that needed no words. Understanding, perhaps, or grace. The twins made small noises in their sleep, and Boone rose to check on them. His hand lingered on the cradle he'd built, touching the smooth wood with wonder, as if amazed to find himself here in this moment. Outside, the snow continued to fall, beginning to blanket their mountain sanctuary in white. But inside the line shack, warmth bloomed like spring, in the crackling fire, in the sleeping babies, and in the heart of a man who was slowly remembering how to believe in mercy again. The weeks flowed together like water in a mountain stream, each day bringing its own quiet rhythms. Snow began to dust the high country, first in hesitant flurries that melted by noon, then in more persistent falls that left the ground sparkling white beneath the pines. Boone settled into the familiar patterns of winter preparation. Each morning, he checked his trap lines before the sun cleared the ridge, breath frosting in the crisp air. Some days he tracked deer through the freshly fallen snow, reading their movements in the delicate prints they left behind. His experienced eye could tell which tracks would lead to meat for their table, and which would waste precious daylight. The cabin slowly transformed under their shared care. Sophia had hung dried herbs from the rafters, sage and mint she'd gathered before the snow, alongside strings of dried peppers that added splashes of red to the weathered beams. The twins' cradle sat in the warmest corner, where drafts couldn't reach them. Their small sounds, coos and gurgles, the occasional cry, filled the space with life. One particularly cold evening found them both inside, warmed by the steady fire Boone had built up against the dropping temperature. He sat in his usual spot, working on a new pair of snowshoes, weaving strips of raw hide in the intricate pattern his father had taught him long ago. Sophia had settled on her low stool near the hearth, a bowl of dried beans in her lap. The soft clicking of beans against tin mixed with the crack and pop of burning pine logs. "These'll make good soup tomorrow," she said, sorting through the beans with practiced fingers. "With that venison you brought in yesterday." She paused in her work, looking up at him with eyes that seemed to hold the firelight. I never properly thanked you, did I? Boone's hand stilled on the snowshoe. For what? For finding us that day. For saving us. Her voice grew softer. We would have died under that cottonwood if you hadn't come along. The memory of that evening flashed through his mind. The infant's cry that had caught his attention, Sophia's fever-bright eyes, the twins wrapped in makeshift blankets. He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly. Not anyone. Most men would have ridden past, or maybe left us at the fort. You gave us a home. The word home hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Boone focused on his snowshoes, trying to ignore the warm feeling her words stirred in his chest. Speaking of home, Sophia continued, her fingers moving steadily through the beans. What will you do when spring comes? The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead, or perhaps he'd been avoiding thinking about it. Spring meant decisions. Spring meant change. Reckon we'll see when it gets here, he said finally, dodging the real question that lay beneath her words. But he could feel her gaze on him, patient and steady as the mountain itself. A cry from the cradle saved him from further discussion. Jacob, the larger of the twins, had woken his brother with an accidental kick. Luke's wails joined his brother's, filling the cabin with their displeasure. Sophia rose to tend them, but Boone was already moving. I've got them, he said, setting aside his work. He lifted both babies with the gentle confidence that had grown over the weeks, settling one in each arm. They're getting so big, Sophia observed, watching him pace slowly around the cabin with his precious burden. Soon they'll be too heavy to carry together like that. Still just little scraps, Boone disagreed. But she was right. The twins had filled out considerably since those first desperate days, their cheeks round and healthy now. As if to prove it, Luke chose that moment to give Boone one of his first real smiles, not the fleeting, reflective grins of earlier weeks, but a genuine expression of joy that lit up his entire tiny face. Look, Sophia exclaimed, abandoning her beans to come closer. Oh, look at that smile! Not to be outdone, Jacob produced his own toothless grin, kicking his feet in delight at the attention. Well now, Boone said, his own smile breaking through despite his best efforts to maintain his usual reserve. Seems we've got ourselves a pair of charmers. Sophia laughed, a clear, bright sound that seemed to warm the cabin better than any fire. They know who takes such good care of them, she said, touching each baby's cheek in turn. They know they're safe. The moment stretched between them, sweet as honey, and just as golden in the firelight. Boone found himself noticing things he usually tried to ignore, the way Sophia's hair caught the light, the gentle curve of her smile, how close she stood as she fussed over the twins in his arms. Later, after the babies were settled, and they'd shared a simple supper of cornbread and the last of the previous day's stew, they sat in comfortable silence. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting soft shadows on the cabin walls. Without conscious thought, Boone began to hum, an old hymn his Rebecca had loved, one she'd sung while working around their own cabin so long ago. The melody filled the quiet space, and he realized it didn't hurt as much as it once had to remember her voice. The hymn spoke of grace and shelter, of finding harbor in the storm. It seemed fitting now, in this place they'd made into a refuge. From her cot on the other side of the cabin, Sophia's voice drifted soft as falling snow. It's beautiful. Boone let the last note fade into silence, but the peace of the moment remained. He looked across the space between them, lit by the dying fire's glow. Sophia lay wrapped in her quilt, her face turned toward him, and something in her expression made his heart beat faster. My Rebecca used to sing it, he said quietly, surprising himself by speaking of her. While she worked, while she rocked our Sarah, said it reminded her that God was near, even way out here in the wild places. She was right, Sophia answered. He is near. I feel it more here than I ever did in town. She paused, then added softly, Thank you for sharing that with me. For sharing all of this. Boone nodded, not trusting his voice. The firelight painted everything in soft edges and warm colors, making the cabin feel like a world apart from all the harsh realities outside. In that moment, he could almost believe in the possibility of new beginnings, of hearts healing and hope taking root in unexpected soil. The twins slept soundly in their cradle, their small breaths barely audible over the settling of logs in the fireplace. Sophia's breathing soon grew deep and regular as sleep claimed her, but Boone sat awake a while longer, watching the last flames dance and thinking about belonging, about how a place becomes home, not through walls and roof beams, but through the lives lived within it. Finally, he banked the fire for the night and lay down on his own cot. The familiar sounds of the cabin surrounded him, the soft creak of timber cooling in the night air, the whisper of wind in the pines outside, the tiny sounds of the twins dreaming their baby dreams. But now there was something else, too, something that had been growing so gradually he'd hardly noticed it taking root, a feeling of rightness, of pieces falling into place that he'd thought forever scattered. As sleep began to claim him, Boone realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow, to the simple pleasure of another day in this life they were building. The thought should have frightened him, but instead it settled over him like a warm blanket, comfortable and right. The snow continued to fall outside, adding another layer to the white blanket that covered their mountain sanctuary. Inside, the fire's glow painted everything in shades of gold, and 3 hearts beat in gentle rhythm, dreaming of belonging. The warm Chinook winds swept down from the north, bringing an unseasonable thaw that turned the pristine snow into rivulets of icy water. The creek that had been little more than a whisper all winter now roared with snowmelt, its banks swelling dangerously high. Boone watched the rising water from the cabin door, concern etching deep lines around his eyes. "I need to check the trap lines," he announced, pulling on his heavy coat. "This flood could wash everything downstream." Sophia looked up from where she sat, nursing the twins. "Be careful," she said softly. "The ground will be treacherous with the thaw." Boone nodded, checking his rifle before slinging it across his back. The weapon had become a constant companion these past months, though he'd used it mainly for hunting. Still, something in the air today made him grateful for its familiar weight. The forest was alive with the sounds of winter's retreat, water dripping from branches, ice cracking as it gave way to warmth, and the occasional crash of snow falling from overburdened pines. Boone moved carefully along the muddy trail, testing each step on the unstable ground. He'd reached the first trap when he saw them. Boot prints pressed into the soft earth, definitely not his own. These were deeper, made by a heavier man, and fresh enough that water was still seeping into their depths. His heart quickened as he studied the direction they led, straight toward the cabin, then veering off into the trees. Keeping his movements deliberate and silent, Boone retrieved his traps, mind racing. Someone was watching them. Whether it was Elias returned or bounty hunters following his trail, the result was the same. Danger had found their sanctuary. When he returned to the cabin, he tried to keep his face neutral, but Sophia knew him too well now. She set Luke down in the cradle and crossed to where he stood, removing his wet boots. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tracks," he admitted, seeing no point in hiding the truth. Fresh ones? Someone's been scouting the area? Fear flickered across her face, but she squared her shoulders. Then we must pray, she said firmly. God has protected us this far. He won't abandon us now. Boone wanted to argue that prayer wouldn't stop a bullet, but the quiet strength in her eyes stopped him. These past months had taught him there was more than one kind of protection. He nodded, watching as she knelt beside the cradle where the twins slept peacefully. Lord, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. We ask for your shield around this cabin and your wisdom to guide us. Keep us safe from those who mean us harm, and show us the path we should take. Boone remained standing but bowed his head, the words settling into the worried corners of his heart. They spent the rest of the day in tense silence, jumping at every sound from the forest. He kept his rifle close, checking and rechecking that it was loaded and ready. Night fell early, as it still did in the mountain winter. They had just finished their evening meal when they heard it, the distinct sound of hoofbeats approaching through the trees. Boone extinguished the lamp with one quick breath, moving to the window while Sophia gathered the twins close. The rider moved slowly, as if searching. Moonlight caught the gleam of metal, a rifle barrel or pistol, before horse and rider melted into the shadows of the pines. Boone stayed at the window, straining to track the sound of retreating hoofbeats, until even those faded into the night sounds of the forest. Get some sleep, he told Sophia, settling into a chair by the door. I'll keep watch. You need rest too, she protested, but he shook his head. Not tonight. She didn't argue further, knowing the set of his jaw meant his mind was made up. Instead, she tucked the twins into their cradle and pulled it closer to her cot. Wake me in a few hours. I'll take a turn. Boone nodded, though they both knew he wouldn't. The night stretched long and cold, broken only by the twins' occasional stirring and the constant rush of the swollen creek. He kept his rifle across his knees, watching moonlight and shadows dance through the trees outside. Dawn arrived with pale fingers of light reaching through the windows. Boone's eyes burned from the long vigil, but he forced himself up and out to check the area around the cabin. The ground told its own story. Broken branches where the horse had pushed through, a few clear hoofprints in the mud, signs of someone watching from the tree line. When he returned inside, Sophia was already up, changing the twins and preparing a simple breakfast. She studied his face as he shut the door behind him. We need to move, she said before he could speak. Farther up the river, away from any trails. The words he'd been thinking all night. Yes, he agreed, but not today. Weather's too uncertain, ground's too soft. We need to wait for things to settle. 2 days at most. She nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes. The cabin had become home, a place of safety and healing for all of them. Leaving it felt like surrendering something precious, even though they both knew staying could be deadly. 2 days, she repeated. We'll need to pack light, only what's essential for the twins. I know some places higher up, Boone said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Old hunting camps, caves we could shelter in until we find somewhere more permanent. The twins began to fuss, picking up on the tension in the air. Sophia moved to comfort them, while Boone began taking stock of their supplies, mentally calculating what they could carry and what they'd have to leave behind. The day passed in strained activity. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts as they prepared for another flight into uncertainty. Boone repaired their remaining bags and packs, while Sophia sorted through the twins' clothes and blankets, choosing the warmest and most durable. Every snapped twig, every shadow moving past the windows, drew their attention. The peace they'd found in their mountain sanctuary felt fragile now, like spring ice over deep water. Boone caught Sophia watching him several times, her face a mixture of trust and fear that made his chest ache. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Sophia broke their uneasy silence. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Boone looked up sharply. "For what?" "For bringing this danger to your door. If it weren't for us—" "Stop," he cut her off more roughly than he'd intended. Softening his voice, he continued, "You didn't bring anything. Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Jacob chose that moment to let out a happy squeal, reaching for Boone with pudgy hands. Without thinking, Boone crossed to the cradle and scooped him up, settling the baby against his chest, where he immediately began gumming the collar of Boone's shirt. "See?" Sophia said, a small smile breaking through her worry. "Together." The word hung between them, full of meaning neither dared to explore. Instead, they focused on practical matters, planning their route, discussing what signals they'd use if they needed to separate, establishing meeting points in case something went wrong. As night fell again, Boone insisted on another watch. This time, Sophia didn't argue. She simply touched his arm as she passed, a gesture of support and understanding that said more than words could have. The night passed without incident, but neither of them could shake the feeling that something was building, like the pressure before a storm. Their sanctuary had been discovered, and soon they would have to run again. But this time was different. This time they weren't fleeing separately into unknown darkness, but together toward whatever future God had planned for them. Morning revealed nothing but the broken branches and hoofprints they'd already found, yet the signs were clear enough. They were being tracked, and their time of peace was coming to an end. Whether it was Elias himself or bounty hunters on his trail, danger was closing in on their mountain refuge. Boone stood in the doorway, watching the twins play on their blanket while Sophia prepared breakfast. The morning light painted everything in soft gold, making the cabin seem even more precious now that they knew they'd have to leave it. He offered up his own silent prayer, not for safety this time, but for strength to protect what had become more important to him than his own life. 2 days. They had 2 days to prepare, to gather their courage and their supplies. 2 days to say goodbye to the place where healing had begun and hope had taken root. 2 days to ready themselves for whatever lay ahead. Outside, the creek continued its wild song, swollen with melting snow and spring promises. Inside, 4 hearts beat in rhythm, bound together by circumstance and choice, by danger and deliverance, by a love that had grown as quietly as mountain flowers pushing through rocky soil. The shadows that haunted their peace were real, but so was their determination to face them together. Whatever came next, they would meet it as a family, unexpected, unplanned, but unshakable in their commitment to each other's survival. The morning dawned cold and gray 2 days after they'd spotted the mysterious rider. Boone stood at the cabin door, scanning the tree line as he did every few minutes now. His shoulders ached from tension, and lack of sleep had left dark circles under his eyes. The twins babbled softly from their cradle, while Sophia stirred a pot of morning porridge. A horse's whinny echoed through the trees. Boone's hand moved to his pistol. "Sophia," he whispered, "take the boys to the back room." She gathered the twins without a word, disappearing behind the rough pine door. Boone watched through the window as a lone rider emerged from the forest. The man sat tall in his saddle, but something about his posture seemed off, too stiff, too calculated. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his horse well-tended. The stranger dismounted with practiced ease, leading his horse toward the cabin. He was thin as a rail, with sharp features and eyes that darted everywhere, taking in details. A government badge glinted on his vest, but it caught the light wrong. Something about it didn't sit right with Boone. "Morning," the man called out, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Wilson, government rider, looking for some missing freight wagons reported out of Fort Lowell." Boone recognized the predatory assessment in those roving eyes. He'd seen that look before, on bounty hunters sizing up their prey. His fingers brushed the grip of his pistol, hidden just behind the doorframe. "Ain't seen no wagons up here," Boone replied evenly. "Pretty rough country for freight." Wilson nodded, still scanning the cabin's exterior. "Mind if I water my horse? Been a long ride." "Creek's right there," Boone gestured with his free hand. "Could offer you some coffee, too, if you're of a mind." The invitation surprised even him, but better to keep the man close and watched than let him skulk around the property. Wilson's eyes narrowed slightly. He hadn't expected hospitality. "Much obliged," he said, tying his horse to a nearby pine. Boone moved to the wood stove, keeping Wilson in his peripheral vision as he poured coffee into 2 tin cups. The man's gaze wandered the cabin interior, lingering too long on the cradle in the corner and the woman's shawl draped over a chair. "Traveling alone?" Wilson asked casually. "Just passing through myself," Boone lied, sliding a cup across the table. "Doing some trapping before the weather turns." A baby's cry pierced the silence. Wilson's head snapped toward the back room, and Boone saw his hand twitch toward his gun. The moment stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. "Seems you got company after all," Wilson said softly. "Just helping some folks who needed shelter." Boone kept his voice neutral. "Weather's been rough." The door creaked open, and Sophia stepped out, holding Luke, who continued to fuss. She'd clearly been listening and chose to show herself, rather than hide. Her chin was high, but Boone could see fear in her eyes. Wilson stared at her and the baby too long, his face unreadable. "Ma'am," he said finally, touching his hat brim again. "Don't mean to disturb your morning." "No disturbance," Sophia replied steadily. "Would you like some bread with your coffee?" The casual offer seemed to unsettle Wilson more than any suspicion could have. He drained his cup in one long swallow and set it down with a sharp click. "Best be moving on," he said. "Got a long ride ahead. Much obliged for the coffee?" Boone walked him to the door, every muscle coiled tight. Wilson mounted up with that same artificial precision, taking one last look at the cabin and its occupants. "If you see any sign of those wagons," he said, "Fort Lowell would be grateful for word." "We'll keep an eye out," Boone replied. They watched him ride away, following the creek back down toward the valley. As soon as he was out of sight, Sophia sagged against the doorframe. "He wasn't from the government," she whispered. "No," Boone agreed grimly. "He wasn't." "What do we do?" "Pack. Now." They moved with quiet urgency, gathering only what they absolutely needed. Boone had already prepared bags of dried meat and hard tack. Sophia focused on the twins' necessities: clothes, blankets, the medicines she'd made from mountain herbs. While Sophia packed, Boone slipped out to follow Wilson's trail. The tracks led straight down toward the valley settlements, just as he'd feared. The bounty hunter was heading back to report what he'd found. When he returned to the cabin, Sophia read the confirmation in his face. She handed him Jacob while she wrapped Luke tighter against the cold. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the first bitter sting of sleet. "We can't wait for morning," Boone said. Sophia nodded, her face pale but determined. They loaded the mule as quickly as they could, sharing glances at the darkening sky. The first ice pellets rattled against the cabin roof as they closed the door for the last time. Boone led them away from the creek, up into rougher country, where the trees grew twisted and the trails disappeared into rock. The twins, sensing the tension, began to cry, sharp, frightened wails that echoed off the canyon walls. Sophia murmured softly to them, but the cold and motion kept them unsettled. Every cry felt like a beacon to Boone, announcing their location to anyone who might be following. The sleet fell harder, coating the ground in treacherous ice. "God guide us," Boone whispered, surprising himself with the prayer. They pushed on as darkness fell, using what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. The mule picked its way carefully over the frozen ground, while Boone led them higher into the range. Each step took them further from the life they'd begun to build, deeper into isolation. Sophia didn't complain about the pace or the weather, though Boone could see her shivering as she cradled the twins. Her strength humbled him. This was the second time she'd been forced to flee into uncertainty with her babies. Yet her face showed only determination, not defeat. The cabin had been more than shelter. It had been the beginning of healing for all of them. In those walls, Boone had remembered how to pray, how to care for others, how to hope. Now they were leaving it behind, running from men who would tear apart their fragile family for money. The sleet turned to wet snow as they climbed higher. The twins' cries gradually subsided into exhausted whimpers. Boone kept them moving until they found a shallow cave, just deep enough to shelter from the wind. They couldn't risk a fire, so they huddled together for warmth, sharing jerky and cold biscuits in the darkness. "Try to sleep," Boone told Sophia. "I'll keep watch." "Wake me for my turn," she insisted, though they both knew he wouldn't. He sat at the cave mouth, watching snow pile up outside while Sophia and the twins slept fitfully behind him. Their tracks would be covered by morning, but they'd need to move again at first light. The bounty hunter would bring others, and the hills would soon be crawling with men hungry for reward money. The night stretched endless and cold. Boone's thoughts turned to the cabin they'd abandoned, the home they'd started to build together. He remembered Sophia tending her herbs by the window, the twins learning to smile, the quiet evenings sharing scripture by lamplight. All of it gone now, traded for this desperate flight into the wilderness. But looking back at Sophia and the babies sleeping behind him, Boone knew he'd make the same choice again. These three had become more precious to him than safety or comfort. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The snow continued falling through the night, blanketing the world in silence. Somewhere below, men were already planning their hunt. But up here in the high country, God's peace still held. Boone touched the Bible in his coat pocket, Sophia's Bible that she'd insisted on bringing, and prayed for strength for what was to come. Dawn would find them pushing deeper into the mountains, leaving civilization further behind. But they carried with them something stronger than comfort or security, a love that had grown in the shelter of their lost cabin, a faith that burned brighter than fear, and a determination to protect what mattered most, no matter the cost. The twins stirred in their sleep, and Sophia automatically reached to comfort them even in her dreams. Boone watched them, his newfound family, and silently renewed his pledge to keep them safe. The bounty hunter's visit had ended their peaceful respite, but it hadn't broken their spirit or their bond. The night grew colder, and the snow fell thicker, but Boone kept his vigil. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, in this moment, they were safe. He held on to that thought as the hours crept by, waiting for whatever the dawn would bring. The wind howled like a living thing, driving sheets of snow against them as they climbed higher into the mountains. Boone led the mule carefully along the narrowing ridge, one hand stretched back to steady Sophia, who walked behind him with the twins bundled tight against her chest. The babies had stopped crying hours ago. too cold and tired even for tears. "Not much further," Boone called over his shoulder, though he could barely see 20 feet ahead through the whirling snow. He recognized these slopes from his trapping days, back when he'd worked these hills with other mountain men. Somewhere ahead lay a hollow where springs kept the ground warm even in winter. Years ago, they'd built a cabin there, rough but solid, if it still stood, if he could find it before dark. Sophia stumbled, catching herself against the mule's flank. Her face was pale beneath her hood, lips blue with cold. The twins stirred weakly under her shawl. "We need shelter soon," she said, voice barely audible above the wind. Boone nodded grimly. The storm had caught them exposed, driving down from the north with sudden fury. The temperature had plummeted as afternoon faded toward evening, and the wet snow now fell so thick it seemed to steal the air from their lungs. He pressed on, scanning the ridge through narrowed eyes. The hollow should be just ahead, tucked into a fold of the mountain where hot springs kept patches of ground clear even in deepest winter. The cabin had been simple: log walls, a stone hearth, space enough for 4 men to sleep. But right now, it might as well have been a palace. The mule's ears suddenly pricked forward. The animal had scented water. Boone felt his heart lift. The springs had to be close. He urged them on, following a dip in the ridge that looked familiar even under its blanket of white. "There!" he shouted suddenly, pointing ahead where dark shapes loomed through the snow. Rough log walls emerged from the storm. The cabin still stood. Sophia made a small sound of relief as they stumbled toward it. The door stuck against years of disuse, but Boone's shoulder convinced it to yield. They stumbled inside just as true darkness began to fall. The cabin smelled of dust and old smoke, but the roof was sound, and the walls kept out the howling wind. "Get those wet things off the babies," Boone ordered, already moving to the hearth. His fingers were nearly numb, but muscle memory guided them as he laid a fire. Dead branches and old pine needles still filled the wood box. No one had used this place in years, but mountain men knew to leave fuel for the next visitor. It might save a life. The flint sparked, caught. Flames licked upward, casting warm light across the cabin's single room. Sophia knelt close, unwrapping the twins from their wet blankets. Both boys were too quiet, their small faces pinched with cold. "Here," Boone said, pulling off his coat. "Wrap them in this while their things dry." He helped her rub their tiny feet and hands, encouraging blood flow back into cold limbs. Gradually, color returned to their faces. Luke began to cry, a thin, reedy sound that had never been so welcome. "There's my brave boy," Sophia whispered, tears in her eyes as she held them close to the growing warmth. "There's my Jacob, my Luke." Boone busied himself gathering more wood, checking windows, laying their wet clothes near the fire to dry. The cabin was crude but solid, thick logs chinked with mud and moss, a proper stone, chimney, shutters that actually closed. The roof didn't leak. There was even an old bunk built into one wall, still holding a mattress of dried grass beneath its musty blankets. But their food bags were nearly empty. The storm had slowed their hunting, and they'd eaten the last of their jerky that morning. The twins would need milk soon, and Sophia needed to keep up her strength to nurse them. "I'm going out to check my traps," Boone said, pulling his newly dried coat back on. "The springs keep some ground clear. There might be rabbits." Sophia looked up sharply. "In this storm?" "Won't go far. Need to get food while we can." She pressed her lips together but nodded. They both knew he was right. "Be careful," she said softly. "We need you." The words followed him out into the darkness, warming something deep in his chest even as the wind cut through his clothes. He hadn't been needed, truly needed, since Sarah died, hadn't let himself be. The snow had eased slightly, and his eyes had adjusted to the dark. He moved carefully through the hollow, setting simple snares where the warm springs kept patches of grass exposed. The work kept him focused, kept him from thinking too much about the woman and babies waiting in the cabin. An hour later, he had his prize, a plump snowshoe hare caught in one of the traps. The animal had died quickly. Mercy in this bitter weather. Boone whispered thanks as he carried it back through the darkness. Sophia had managed to find an old pot among the cabin's sparse furnishings. She'd cleaned it with snow and set it ready by the fire. Neither spoke as Boone skinned and dressed the rabbit, adding the last of their dried vegetables to make a thin stew. The twins slept peacefully now, properly warm for the first time in hours. Their small faces glowed in the firelight, reminding Boone painfully of another baby, another firelit cabin years ago. He pushed the memories away, focusing on the practical task of cooking. They ate in grateful silence when the stew was ready, savoring every spoonful. The wind continued to howl outside, but in here was warmth and food and a moment's peace. Sophia nursed the twins once they woke, humming softly to them. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said after a while, her voice gentle in the firelit quiet. Boone looked up from where he was mending a tear in his shirt. "What's that?" "That first night when you found us under the cottonwood. Why did you stop?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Heard the babies crying," he said finally. "Couldn't ride past that." "But you hadn't prayed in years, you said. Hadn't helped anyone since your wife died. What made you stop for us?" The question pierced deeper than he expected, past all his careful barriers. He set down his mending, stared into the fire. "I was angry at God," he said slowly. "After Sarah, after we lost her and the baby, seemed like prayer was just words, empty words. Figured if God didn't care about a good woman and an innocent child, he didn't care about anything." Sophia listened silently, her face compassionate in the firelight. "But when I heard those babies crying," he shook his head. "Couldn't ignore it, like something broke open inside me, something I thought was dead." "Faith can be like that," Sophia said softly. "It dies and comes back to life, like spring after winter." She shifted Luke to her shoulder, patting his back gently. "Maybe God sent us to each other, all of us needing to start again." Boone felt tears burn unexpectedly in his eyes. He hadn't cried since Sarah's death, hadn't let himself feel anything that deeply. But here in this fire-lit cabin, with snow falling outside and this gentle woman speaking truth so simply, the walls he'd built around his grief began to crack. "I miss her," he whispered. "Every day. Miss who I was when she was alive. Miss believing in anything." Sophia reached across the space between them, took his rough hand in her free one. Her touch was warm, alive, anchoring him in the present even as old pain washed through him. "Then maybe that's why God brought us here," she said. "Not just so you could save us, but so we could help save each other, help each other believe again." The twins slept peacefully in their makeshift bed, their breathing soft and regular. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the storm continued its wild song, but in here was warmth and hope, and the first tentative steps toward healing. Boone looked at their joined hands, then at Sophia's face, gentle, strong, full of a faith he'd thought he'd lost forever. Something shifted in his chest, like ice breaking up in spring. "Maybe," he said quietly. And for the first time in years, he felt the stirring of prayer in his heart, not empty words, but real gratitude. For this shelter in the storm, for these sleeping babies, for this woman who spoke truth with such simple grace, for the chance to begin again. The fire burned low as night deepened around the cabin. Soon they would need to sleep, to rest for whatever tomorrow might bring. But for now, they sat in comfortable silence, hands still joined, while the wind sang outside and something new and fragile took root in the warm darkness between them. The mountain spring brought renewal with each passing week. Snow retreated up the slopes, leaving behind tender grass shoots and the first brave wildflowers. Boone stood at the cabin door one morning, watching winter's grip loosen its hold on their sheltered hollow. The old spring that had drawn him here still flowed strong and clear, bubbling up from deep in the earth. He carried water back to their small cabin, pausing to watch Sophia hanging freshly washed clothes in the strengthening sunlight. The twins sat on a blanket nearby, batting at dandelion fluff floating on the breeze. At 6 months old, they were growing sturdy, their baby faces round with health. "Ground's soft enough to work now," said, setting down the water buckets. "Might be able to get some planting done." Sophia's eyes lit up. "Really? I was hoping we might grow a little garden, but I wasn't sure." "Found some old bean seeds in the cabin stores," Boone said. "Corn, too. If we clear that south-facing patch, they should take well enough." They spent the next few days preparing the soil, working side by side in the warming sun. Boone broke the ground with a hoe, while Sophia followed, dropping seeds into the fresh furrows. The twins watched from their blanket, cooing at butterflies. "My father had a garden," Sophia said as she worked. "Used to say a person wasn't properly settled somewhere until they'd put seeds in the ground." She patted the dark earth over a row of beans, her movements gentle and sure. "Reckon he was right about that," Boone replied, leaning on his hoe. Just then, Luke managed to roll himself over, a new trick that delighted him. His happy squeal startled a nearby meadowlark into flight. Sophia laughed, a bright, unexpected sound that made Boone's heart skip. It was the first time he'd heard her truly laugh since finding her beneath that cottonwood tree. The days took on a sweet rhythm. Mornings began with chores, feeding chickens they'd traded for with a passing settler, tending the garden, repairing what needed fixing. At midday, they gathered for prayer, Sophia reading from her worn Bible, while the twins napped in their cradle. Evenings brought simple suppers and songs, Sophia's clear voice carrying old hymns into the twilight, while Boone hummed along. The twins grew stronger daily. Jacob took his first wobbling steps holding on to the cabin wall, Luke following close behind. Their baby babble filled the cabin with life and joy. Boone found himself storing up these moments like treasure. The way sunlight caught in Sophia's hair as she worked, the twins' delighted giggles when he played peekaboo, the peaceful quiet of their shared prayers. One afternoon, while mending the old rail fence that marked their property line, Boone paused in his work. The spring air was sweet with pine sap and new grass. Below him, smoke rose peaceful from their cabin chimney. Sophia's washing fluttered on the line like prayer flags. The twins played in their pen, visible from where he worked. Without quite meaning to, he pulled out his knife and began carving into one of the new fence posts. The letters emerged slowly. B+S. He traced them with weathered fingers, remembering another set of initials carved long ago. But this wasn't betrayal of old love. It was hope for new life. That evening, after the twins were asleep, Boone pulled out paper and ink he'd been saving. It was time to think about the future. Their future. The Territory Land Office would need formal registration come summer if they meant to claim this place properly. "What are you writing?" Sophia asked, settling beside him with her mending. "Letter to the Land Office," he replied, carefully forming each letter. Aiming to register our claim when the snow clears off the high passes. Our claim? Her voice was soft with question. Boone looked up, meeting her eyes in the lamplight. If you're willing, could make a proper home here. You, me, the boys. Already feels like... He trailed off, uncertain how to express what this place, these people, had come to mean to him. Sophia's hand found his across the table. Yes, she said simply. It already feels like home. The lamp burned low as Boone finished his letter. Outside, spring peepers sang their evening chorus. The twins slept peacefully in their cradle. And in the warm quiet of their cabin, hope bloomed as surely as the first wildflowers dotting the mountainside. The afternoon sun warmed the mountain hollow as Boone split wood near the cabin. A movement caught his eye. A lone rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the bright sky. Boone's heart went cold. Even at this distance, he knew that lean figure, that familiar way of sitting a horse. Elias Tisdale. The man who had abandoned Sophia in childbirth now sat his mount like a dark specter against the spring sky. He looked gaunt, his clothes ragged, but the rifle across his saddle gleamed with deadly purpose. Inside the cabin, Sophia was humming to the twins. When Boone called her name, she stepped out and went pale as chalk. The twins fussed in her arms as if sensing her fear. "I've changed, Sophia," Elias called down, his voice carrying on the wind. "I only want what's mine, my wife, my sons. We can start fresh somewhere else." Boone moved between them, his hand near his pistol. "You lost any right to them when you left them to die." Elias's face twisted, but he withdrew without further words, disappearing over the ridge. That night, a sharp crack split the darkness. Boone rushed out to find the corral fence broken and their best horse gone. At first light, Boone took up his rifle and followed Elias's trail. He caught up to him at the creek crossing, where winter melt made the water run high and fast. "This is your only warning," Boone said, rifle steady. "Leave and don't return." Elias's eyes burned with a desperate light. He backed his stolen horse away slowly. "I'll be back," he spat. "Those are my sons, my wife. You can't keep what's mine." He wheeled the horse and galloped away, leaving only hoofprints and a cold fear in the spring morning. 2 nights after Elias's threat, darkness wrapped the cabin in shadow. Only embers glowed in the hearth as the family slept. Boone's eyes snapped open at a soft creak. Too late. The door burst inward with a crash. Elias charged in like a wild thing, desperation making him reckless. His boots thundered across the plank floor as Sophia screamed and lunged for the twins' cradle. With cruel force, he shoved her aside. She hit the wall hard and crumpled. "No!" Boone roared, reaching for his rifle. Elias snatched up little Jacob, who began to wail. His brother Luke's cries joined in. Terrified harmony. The flash of Elias's pistol lit the cabin like lightning. White-hot pain blazed across Boone's shoulder as the bullet grazed him. Fighting through the burning agony, Boone brought his rifle up and fired. The shot went wide as Elias ducked and ran, clutching the screaming child to his chest. The cabin door banged against the wall, and their footsteps vanished into the howling wind. Boone tried to stand but stumbled, blood soaking his shirt. "Follow at first light," he gasped to Sophia. "I can't. Too much blood." She was already tearing strips from her skirt for bandages, tears streaming down her face as Luke wailed in his cradle. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and fast, threatening to cover any trail Elias might leave. "Hold still," Sophia whispered, pressing the cloth to Boone's wound. Her hands shook but stayed gentle. "We'll find him. We'll bring Jacob home." Through the haze of pain, Boone watched the snow swirling beyond the broken door. Every moment, Elias gained more distance with their stolen child. But first, they had to survive this night. Dawn crept over the mountains in pale streaks. Sophia's hands trembled as she cinched the saddle on their remaining mule. Little Luke whimpered against her chest, secured in a sling made from her shawl. The morning air bit cold and sharp through their clothes. Boone leaned heavily against the cabin wall, his face gray with pain. The wound in his shoulder had stopped bleeding, but weakness dragged at his limbs. Still, his eyes burned with determination as Sophia helped him mount. "I reckon it's time," he said softly, settling behind her on the mule. They followed Elias's tracks through the fresh powder. The snow kept falling in lazy swirls, threatening to erase their only guide. Boone's breath came ragged against Sophia's back as they climbed higher into the pines. "Lord," Boone's voice cracked, breaking years of silence, "guide us to that child. Don't let darkness win." The prayer hung in the crystal air like frost. Evening painted the sky purple when Sophia spotted something pale against dark brush. Her heart lurched as she dismounted. A torn scrap of baby blanket fluttered from thorny branches. Jacob's blanket. Night forced them to shelter beneath a granite ledge. They shared the last of their jerky, neither tasting it. Luke slept fitfully while Boone drifted into fevered dreams. In his sleep he saw Sarah, his late wife, standing in morning light. "Don't let the darkness win," she whispered, her face gentle. "Love is stronger than hate." He woke with a start to find Sophia's hand clasped in his. She hadn't slept, keeping watch through the long hours. Now sunrise painted the snow gold, and fresh strength filled Boone's heart. His faith, dormant for so long, blazed to life like morning breaking over mountain peaks. "We'll find him," Sophia whispered, squeezing his hand. They found Elias at sunrise, standing near a canyon rim with wild eyes and trembling hands. Little Jacob wailed in his arms, tiny fists reaching toward the cold morning air. Fresh snow dusted the rocks beneath his unsteady feet. "Stay back!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking. "The law's gonna hang me anyway. Might as well end it clean." Boone slowly lowered his rifle into the snow, wincing at his wounded shoulder. "No need for more darkness, Elias," he said softly. "The good Lord offers mercy to all who seek it." "Mercy?" Elias laughed bitterly. "After what I done?" Sophia stepped forward, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Please," she whispered, "give him back. Let us help you." "I'm so tired," Elias murmured, looking down at Jacob's face. "Tired of running, tired of the fear." His shoulders sagged as the fight drained from him. With trembling steps, he moved toward Boone. Carefully, tenderly, he placed Jacob in Boone's strong arms. The baby immediately quieted, sensing safety. But as Elias stepped back, his boot caught ice. Time seemed to slow as he stumbled, arms windmilling against empty air. Boone lunged forward with his free hand, but his fingers only brushed Elias's coat before the man slipped over the edge. The canyon swallowed his final cry. Sophia fell to her knees in the snow, shoulders shaking with sobs. Boone held Jacob close, sheltering the child from the bitter wind. Above them, snowflakes drifted silent and soft over the canyon rim, nature's quiet blessing on this moment of tragedy and grace. "Lord have mercy," Boone whispered, his words carried away by the mountain wind. Spring painted the mountains in gentle strokes of green. Tender grass pushed through melting snow, and wild iris dotted the meadow with purple promise. The morning air carried sweetness from budding pines. Boone and Sophia stood before the cairn they had built, stone by stone. The wooden cross rose straight against the blue sky, marking Elias's final rest. They had chosen this spot carefully, a peaceful overlook where wildflowers would bloom each year. "Seems fitting to call this place Mercy's Bluff," Boone said softly, his hand steady on Sophia's shoulder. She nodded, wiping a quiet tear. That evening, Boone finished his letter by lamplight. His careful words claimed the land for homestead, their hidden valley with its spring-fed creek and sheltering pines. He sealed it with melted candle wax, ready for the trader who followed the mountain trails each spring. 3 days later, the trader's wagon creaked into their clearing. He promised to deliver the letter and brought welcome news. The army had closed their search for Elias months ago. As the wagon disappeared down the trail, Boone felt peace settle over him, like a warm blanket. The days lengthened into summer. Sophia planted columbine and mountain lupine around the cairn, tending them with gentle hands. The twins, Jacob and Luke, toddled through the grass chasing butterflies, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Their small feet left tiny prints beside the flowers, life dancing next to memory. Inside their cabin, Boone carefully set the carved pine cradle beside the hearth. Its smooth wood glowed in the firelight, ready for the next generation. He had made it with love during those first uncertain days, and now it stood as testament to their journey from strangers to family. One evening, as shadows lengthened across their valley, they gathered for supper. Steam rose from bowls of rabbit stew, and fresh-baked cornbread filled the air with warmth. The twins sat in their high chairs, faces already smeared with honey. They joined hands around the table, Boone's weathered fingers gentle against Sophia's palm, the boys' small hands completing their circle. Boone's deep voice led the prayer, giving thanks for the food before them and the life they had almost lost. As twilight deepened the sky to purple, Sophia looked across the table at Boone. Her eyes held starlight and memory. "You went hunting for meat that morning," she whispered, remembering their beginning beneath the dying cottonwood. Boone smiled softly, his face tender in the lamplight. "And the Lord sent me a family instead." The twins babbled sleepily, ready for bed. Outside their window, crickets sang their evening hymn. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and peace through their home, their sanctuary carved from wilderness by grace. Here at Mercy's Bluff, they had found more than shelter. They had found healing, redemption, and the quiet miracle of love growing wild and true as mountain flowers. Their table, once empty, now overflowed with blessing. Their hearts, once wounded, beat strong with gratitude for this unexpected gift, a family born from Mercy's endless grace. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.